Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, and the practices of great military leaders, all by way of distilling lessons that we can use in our business and professional lives. So today, I'm going to talk about optimizing your resources. And I'm going to do this in the context of, so this comes out of a phenomenon in actually World War II that I've, kind of kept track of. And that is, contrary to what people think, during World War II, the branch of the service with the most water-going craft, I'll call them, was not the Navy. It was not the Coast Guard. And in fact, the Navy and the Coast Guard combined still had fewer water-going craft than the United States Army. And it seems so strange. Why would the Army have all these boats? And the reason is because the Army needs to cross rivers and cross lakes and that sort of thing. And so you say, well, why didn't they just have the Navy do it? And the answer is, back in World War II, there was very little interoperability between the service branches. So, for example, in World War II, the Army had what was known as originally, well, it started out as the Army Air Service back in World War I. It became known as the Army Air Corps after that and through the very beginning of World War II. And then it became the Army Air Forces. It wasn't until post-World War II that the Air Force became a separate branch of the military. And there was a big discussion about whether whether airplanes in essence warranted having a separate branch of the military, and eventually it was decided they did. Having said that, the Navy also had what was essentially an Air Force, the Naval Air Service, right? And those planes flew off aircraft carriers, right? And you couldn't have Army Air Force pilots flying off of aircraft carriers was difficult because it's a completely different skill to take off and land on this, little, super short runway, as well as to navigate over water. And then as the Marine Corps developed its combined arms philosophy, the Marine Corps also developed an air arm in order to, among other things, provide close air support to Marine Corps ground operations. And again, it's a different skill. It's not what the Air Force does. It's not what the Navy did. The ability to strafe the enemy or drop munitions on the enemy close to your ground troops without hitting them is a very particular skill, and obviously a very important skill, because it greatly aids your ground troops in terms of how effective they can be when you can bring airborne firepower to the battlefield, over and above artillery, howitzers, and cannons, and that sort of thing. So there has been, as military technology has developed, there has been this sort of push and pull over, do we develop separate branches of the military, or how do we deal with this? So I want to give you just an idea of how the current U.S. military stacks up in terms of its use of waterborne craft and aircraft. Okay, so I'm going to share just a few statistics with you because I think they're kind of interesting, and it gives you a sense. So the United States Navy currently has approximately 470 ships. Okay, so that's aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, um, supply. I'm sorry, not supply ships, submarines, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and it has approximately 3,000 small boats. These would be patrol craft and those kinds of things. Okay, now the U.S. Coast Guard, which during wartime it falls under the um, uh, Department of the Navy, which is part of the Department of Defense. Otherwise, it's part of the Department of Homeland Security. But nonetheless, the U.S. Coast Guard has about 250 Coast Guard cutters that are 65 feet in length or longer. Okay, so that's kind of the main um, ship, if you will, that the Coast Guard uses in its operations, and the largest Coast Guard cutter, which is the one um, uh, that's in use, is called the Legend class cutter, or otherwise known as the National Security Cutter. Now, interestingly enough, the Coast Guard at times will operate in the Persian Gulf, because the Persian Gulf is essentially almost all coastal waters, not literally so, but a lot of it is sort of littoral waters. And so the kind of patrol duties and interdiction duties and such that the Coast Guard trains for is a prevalent need in the Persian Gulf. Okay, and the Coast Guard has another nearly 2,000 small boats, the most common being about 25 feet long. So you think about that, that's maybe what, double the length of a car, you know? So altogether about 2,250 waterborne craft in the Coast Guard versus not quite 3,500 in the United States Navy. Having said that, as of June of 2024, the United States Army still has 132 watercraft in its fleet. They're operated by the U.S. Army Transportation Corps, and the watercraft are used for transporting warfighting supplies, combat vehicles, cargo, etc. And they range in size from a 75-foot tugboats to 315-foot logistic support vehicles. Now, 315 feet, keep in mind, that's about the length of a football field. So that's already a pretty sizable ship. That's the size of a destroyer, for example, or it's around this. I'm sorry, not a destroyer. That's the size of a fast attack submarine, and so it's a pretty sizable craft. You say, so why does the Navy have? I mean, why does the Army have these watercraft? Well, because they need to be able to resupply and transport vehicles, etc., sometimes over water. So I'm going to leave it there because I'm going to come back to this in a few minutes. Okay. Now, by the way, the Army, as recently as earlier this year, had quite a few more boats, but they've been decreasing them over the last few years. Okay, so that is waterborne craft. Now let's look at aircraft. Okay, so as you might expect, the U.S. Air Force has the largest fleet of aircraft, approximately 5,500. It might surprise you, though, to find out that the U.S. Navy has got approximately 4,000 aircraft, both fixed wing and rotary. Okay, so The U.S. Navy flies the FA-18, both what's called the Legacy version, A, B, and C, and the Hornet and the Super Hornet, the EF versions. The electronic attack squadrons also fly a version of the FA-18. It has a different number, but it's essentially the same platform. It's just equipped with different kinds of avionics. And it also flies helicopters. Okay. Now, it also flies, by the way, the twin prop I think it's an E4 for command and control. So when I was with ACC Log Wing, Air Command Control and Logistics Wing, right? Our one of our major platforms was the E4, I believe it was. It's a twin turboprop platform, and it takes off from the carrier. It hangs out basically above the carrier, and the carrier can transmit messages to that aircraft. And that aircraft, because it's up high, can transmit messages to other types of airborne craft that are much farther away from the ship, that the ship would have trouble communicating with, but by being high up, they have a more direct line of communication, right? That's why it's airborne command and control. So, like I said, in total, the U.S. Navy has about 4,000 aircraft, or a little bit less than 80% of the number of aircraft that the U.S. Air Force has. Now, the U.S. Army, as of 2023, that was the most recent figures I could find, has about 3,900 manned aircraft, mostly helicopters, okay? Helicopter gunships, transports, that sort of thing. And in addition to that, it has approximately 700 large unmanned aerial systems, commonly called drones. So in reality, the Army actually has more aircraft than the Navy does, even though I don't think most of us think about the Army as having anything to do with flying, right? And so they've got about 4,600, or over 80% of the number of aircraft that the U.S. Air Force has. Okay, the Marine Corps now has approximately 1,200 aircraft. They have about 300 fighters. Okay, and they fly, by the way, two of the same platforms that the Navy flies. They fly the FA-18s. They fly what are called Legacy Hornets, A, C, and Ds. And they fly the F-35, the BC variant, which is for which has a carrier. It's for carrier launch and recovery, and also I don't know if they can launch them off the amphibs. Okay, but then they also fly the AV-8Bs, which have vertical takeoff and landing capabilities, which are flown off the LHDs and the LHAs, the amphibious air ships that the Navy uses on behalf, or uses in order to transport Marine Corps units from place to place. Okay, so they have over 700 helicopters across 7 different platforms. They're used for pretty much the same reason that the Army uses helicopters: transport, combat support, that sort of thing. They have 27 transports, and those include, I got to fly on one of those. Basically, the Marine Corps has I think about 10, I want to say, Cessna Citation corporate jets that they use for transporting senior officers from place to place for meetings or whatever. Like I said, I got to fly on one time. It was really cool. It was the only time I've ever flown on a corporate jet like that. And then it has about 110 trainers and about 64 refueling aircraft. So all told, like I said, about 1,200 aircraft in the Marine Corps. The U.S. Coast Guard has approximately 200 helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft for patrolling purposes, transportation purposes, rescue. Um, you know, um, the Coast Guard uses helicopters to rescue stranded boaters, etc. So basically, every branch of the U.S. military has got aircraft in it, and what three? Well, actually, by the way, the Marine Corps has watercraft as well. They have what are called LCACs. They're amphibious landing boats, essentially. Um, so, four out of the five branches of the military have boats or waterborne craft. So, the question I think that is the natural question is why? Why are we taking resources like this and splitting them up and essentially training soldiers to man boats? We're teaching Marines to fly. We're teaching, um, soldiers to fly. Why don't we just have all the flying done by the Air Force? Why don't we have all the watercraft manned by the Navy, right? And then why don't we have the Army handle all the ground operations, maybe including amphibious operations, which has traditionally been the purview of the Marine Corps, right? And in fact, there's been a battle for most of the last, I think, century and a half um, over the Marine Corps because there are interests that want to see the Marine Corps done away with because they feel it's an historic relic. And I will say that in some respects that is true because Marines, the original job of Marines were to be on Navy ships. They reported directly to the captain of the ship at a time when there were wooden, square rigged sailing ships. And when those vessels were at sea, the captain had absolute command over everything that happened, but he was vulnerable to mutiny. And so a contingent of Marines was on board in order to protect the captain and to put down any unrest on the ship in order that the captain could keep control. Now, they also did sharpshooter duty from the masts and spars of the ship during battle, but their main reason they were present on the ship was to essentially sustain the captain's command, right? And so we don't need that anymore. Okay, we don't have Marine contingents on ships anymore in order to essentially protect the captain. So the Marines in the 19th century transitioned into being America's amphibious landing force, quick reaction force. That's essentially what they've been. There was a big fight, though, after World War II. Like I said, there were interests that were trying to get the Marine Corps to essentially be closed or disbanded. That would be a better word, because they thought the Marine Corps was not necessary anymore. And in fact, one of the Marine Corps' major skills is they have maintained very strong political connections, and that's how they've been able to survive. But I'm going to set that argument aside, and let's stipulate for the purposes of this show that the Marine Corps and the Army, as ground forces, do serve different purposes. By the way, in World War II, both the Army and the Marine Corps mounted amphibious operations. Interestingly enough, there was just so many of them that had to be done. The Marine Corps couldn't do all of them. But today, the Marine Corps handles sort of littoral combat, if you will, amphibious combat, and the Army handles ground combat, occupation activities, those sort of things. So we could justify having a Marine Corps and an Army, but why do we have a naval air arm? Why do we have what amounts to an Army Air Force when we have an Air Force. So it really comes down to the issue that if you saw any of my social media posts, it really comes down to the issue of which direction are you going to go? Essentially, what amounts to a sense of duplicate training or tighter coordination between different parts of the military. Okay, now, one of the things that we could do, for example, is we could, in the military, we could say, okay, from here on out, only the Navy is going to conduct waterborne activities. So if there's a need to transport Army vehicles across a river, they're going to have a naval contingency with them, and that naval contingency is going to handle the waterborne operation. Now, why would that be desirable? Well, it would be desirable because all the boats in the U.S. military would be essentially owned and maintained by the Navy. And presumably, as a waterborne service, they could accumulate all the knowledge necessary to operate and maintain those boats. And that would be their sole focus. Okay. However, yes. And so but the downside of that is, or the potential downside of that is the Navy would have to learn to operate in all kinds of different marine, I'm going to put that in quotes because we usually don't think of rivers as being marine, they're riverine, but water environments, right? So the Navy today has really no capacity to operate in riverine warfare. Now, it did have some experience with that in Vietnam, although the Coast Guard has had much more experience operating in rivers and deltas in Vietnam, for example. The Navy today has little, if any, knowledge of riverine warfare. It would have to get that experience. Okay. Now it could. Okay. And in fact, it could take over the part of the Army Transportation Command that handles riverine services. They could be transferred to the Navy and turned into sailors. Okay. We could do that and consolidate all waterborne, watercraft oriented military activities in the Navy. Here's a possible downside to that, though, and that is that the coordination between Navy and Army would become more important. Okay. And one of the things that I find when I talk to people who haven't been in the military or haven't studied the military is there seems to be a sense that there's a military culture and it's homogenous. The fact of the matter is, though, Army culture is very different than Navy culture, which is very different, both of which are different from Marine Corps culture, all three of which are different from Air Force culture. Okay. And I've spoken about this on other shows, even within what are called communities in a branch of the service. And I'll talk about the Navy because that's the one I know the best. So there are profound cultural differences between naval aviation and submarine warfare and surface warfare and special operations, i.e. Navy SEALs, and Seabees, construction battalions. Each of those communities within the Navy have a different culture, and there are culture clashes that come up between them. In fact, when I was with CAG 14 or CVW 14 is what it's really known as, Carrier-Borne Air Wing, Carrier Air Wing 14, right? We wore brown shoes because historically naval aviation they're known as the brown shoe Navy because they wore brown shoes. Okay. We would fairly derisively refer to surface warfare, naval surface warfare people as shoes because they wore black shoes, right? Oh, he's a shoe, right? That was not a term of, that was not a complimentary term, right? And one of the reasons we did that is because naval aviation is a much more relaxed culture. It's a much more, it's a culture in which the most junior and the most senior interact far more and far more collegially than in the surface warfare culture, where a junior person would almost never interact with the captain of a ship. Okay, whereas a squadron, the most junior person in the squadron, a plane captain, would have, I don't want to say regular interactions with the squadron CO, but we'll have interactions with the squadron CO. And if they have an idea about something, they can walk up to the squadron CO and say, "Sir, I have this idea that I wanted to share with you." And he's almost for sure going to listen, unless he's busy and has to get to a meeting or something. Okay. And by the way, the same is that kind of cultural closeness between juniors and seniors is also fairly similar in the submarine warfare community. Okay, but again, it's so. But there are other differences there. So, because submarines are dealing with nuclear reactors, they're a very nerdy bunch. Even the most junior person is, and I in this case, I'm not using nerd as an insult. They're just very smart people, because they're dealing with a nuclear reactor. And so again, the whole feeling of the community is very different. So coordinating activities between communities that have different cultures is difficult, and it can sometimes create problems of communication, of interaction, of of keeping their eye on the mission. Okay, we think of the U.S. military as operating very seamlessly in a joint environment, but that's not at all true. There are lots and lots of issues that come up. Now, the U.S. military today operates in combined arms and jointly much better than it did even 20 years ago. Certainly much better than it did 75 years ago during World War II, Korea, that sort of thing. Okay, but the idea that the Army and the Navy work together seamlessly, not really. I mean, the two branches that work together the most closely and the most regularly, the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps, because they're called sister services. They're both part of the sea services. Even there are profound cultural differences that make interoperation challenging at times. And so if you have an LHD, it's a type of amphibious ship that transports a Marine Corps unit, the crew of the ship is Navy. The people they're transporting are Marine Corps. And there are oftentimes conflicts, not big conflicts, but they just don't get along. They don't see eye to eye. I've mentioned this before, that some of the fiercest fights that my dad ever saw when he was in the military were between the Navy and the Marine Corps. So the Navy would call the Marine Corps guys jarheads, because they, generally speaking, a lot of them have shaved heads, I guess. And the Marine Corps guys would call the Navy swabbies, because they used to swab the decks with mops, right? So the swabbies and the jarheads would get into fights, unless the Army showed up, in which case the swabbies and the jarheads would get together and beat the heck out of the Army. So that was how it worked in my dad's time. He used to tell me these stories, and we'd laugh about them. While I wouldn't say things are that bad these days, that still is around. And so the trade-off of, for example, putting all watercraft with the Navy and putting all aircraft with, let's say, the Air Force, is these branches of the service would really have to learn how to work together. And that can be a very tough challenge. And so the decision really kind of post World War II. So going back to a little bit of history for a moment, during World War II, there was a separate Department of the Army and a separate Department of the Navy, and the Marine Corps was part of the Department of the Navy, which it still is to this day. There's never been a separate Department of the Marine Corps. Okay, post World War II, I believe it was the Defense Act of 1947, if memory serves. That's what created the Department of Defense, which became the umbrella agency of the government under which both the Department of the Army and the Department of the Navy were placed, and the newly created Department of the Air Force. So it was when those branches were put under a unified command, if you will, of the Department of Defense, that there really started to be a lot more coordination between what was going on in the branches. So, for example, how rates and ranks were set up. Each branch prior to that, each service prior to that had its own way of setting up rates and ranks. After that, the system of E1 through E9 and O1 through O10, I think was the highest one in World War II, or O9. That's when that was developed. And each branch of the military had to conform to that system. Okay, so since World War II, there has been a lot more coordinated action between the various service branches. However, they do not interact seamlessly. Even today, they don't interact seamlessly. So, what does this mean then for our businesses and professions? So, as we look at adopting technology, as we look at dealing with complex operations in our businesses, in order to optimize our resources, we need to look at this question of, are we going to essentially duplicate training, or are we going to require greater cooperation between different parts of our businesses? Okay, and it's not clear for any particular industry which is the better choice. Okay, now when we talk about different training, so because of the way the Marine Corps uses aircraft and the Army uses aircraft and the Navy, each of those has a distinct training regimen. Having said that, the fundamentals of flying are the fundamentals of flying. So there's a lot of duplicate training that goes on among the service branches, just getting qualified aviators who can fly either a fixed wing or a rotary wing aircraft. And then it's after that, when they go to more advanced flight training, that they learn the specifics of what they're going to be doing for their service branch. So the same thing is true in our businesses. So let's take AI. So are we going to, as we look to deploy AI, a new technology, are we going to look to have like a department of AI in our businesses, where the people there go not only broadly but deeply into how AI can positively impact our businesses and our practices? Or are we going to let each of our existing departments adopt AI in the way that works best for them? If we go with the first one, so we can focus all of our AI training on that one department, okay, and then the people within that department can coordinate with people in other departments to see how they can use their AI skills and AI techniques, whatever they do with it, to help these other departments better achieve their missions, better achieve their goals, their objectives. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is by letting each department handle it, and then they'll have to develop training regimens for the AI section in their department, right? And then once those people are trained up on AI, okay, then they'll figure out how to best use it within that specific department. In the same way that boats and aircraft work within the military. Okay, which is going to be better? Which is going to be more efficient? I can't tell you that. We can look at the military example where they've done a dispersed model where each service branch figures out how to use new technology on their own, whether it's boats and aircraft. Now it's things, for example, drones. So all the branches of the military use drones, okay, and they train their own pilots and all of that kind of thing. So is that the best way to do it? I don't know. Part of in the military is you have sort of historical inertia. This is how the service branches have operated now for over 100 years, and they very jealously guard their territory, so to speak. So when there's not a lot for the Navy to do, the Navy, in terms of especially blue water activities, the Navy will embed sailors in ground units to do intelligence or whatever. If I were in charge, I wouldn't do that. I would tell the Navy, focus on keeping your skills up in what you're trained to do. And if we need to shrink you right now because we don't have a need for a big blue water Navy, then that's what we're going to do. Okay. But the Navy likes, they want to keep their personnel. Each branch of the military wants to keep its personnel. And so it finds things for them to do, even as the other service branches want to sort of keep the other ones out of their domains. So how will it best work in your business? That's the question I think each of us as a business owner or as a professional, that's the question we need to be answering. Do we want to create multiple training regimen within the various parts of our business? Or do we want to create a focused department that maybe is a brand new department for our business that will go very, very deep into the technology, but then also have the responsibility to go broadly with the technology in order to understand how their deep knowledge can be put to the service of the other departments that are pursuing the mission of your organization, of your company or your professional practice. So that's the message I wanted to bring to you today in terms of optimizing your resources. I invite you to think about that question. And it's especially in the realm of AI. I think that's going to become a more and more important technology, and how it's deployed. It should be done intentionally as opposed to just letting it sort of come into our organizations and be adopted sort of willy-nilly. That would be, I think, the worst possible way to deal with it. Better to give it considered thought, try things out, see how they work. If they seem to be working well, great. And if not, change how they're working. You may want to even change from one of these models to the other. That it may turn out that initially you select the wrong model. You select, let's say, the separate department for the new technology model, and then choose coordination is between that department and all your other departments. That's kind of the challenge. That will be the challenge. And you may need to swap that out for the other model, which is each department adopts technology, adopts AI, and figures out on its own how to use it, and you have duplicate training, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those are my thoughts on this, and you can see I think how this comes out of how military doctrine, in this particular case, doctrine and history. So I'd be curious about what you think about this. So after the show posts on YouTube, there will be links to all the social media. Feel free to post a comment. You can also email me. My email address will be in the show notes as well. Would really love to hear your thoughts on this topic. So that's the show for today. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. And our topic is relationships in the workplace. Now, I'm not talking about interpersonal relationships. I'm actually going to talk about that in a future, another episode. What I'm going to be talking about is the types of relationships that we want to develop in the workplace in order to facilitate our success. I've identified 8 of them. And that's not to say we're going to cultivate all 8 types, but it's to give you a framework to think about which of these relationships do I need to develop, which will be crucial to my success. So that's tomorrow on People Making Money at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And then on Thursday is my every other week show, Jiggers' Place. And I have a guest this week, Anna Rook, who is the co-founder of Akasha Superfoods. And Anna's going to be talking about how to live a healthy life. And while her company is product-based, I think you will find that Anna has a very in-depth view of what it means to live a healthy life. So I hope you'll join me for that. So I thank you so much for joining me today on Business Lessons from the Military, and signing off as I always do. Oh, one last thing before I go. If you are not a subscriber, I would ask you to consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. We're up over 300 subscribers now. I met my goal for this year and actually exceeded it, so I'm going to continue to build. But if you're a subscriber, you'll get a notification every time we go live and a show posts, and so you'll never miss an episode of the various Way to Wow shows. So thank you again for being with me, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my bell.